Hello and welcome to a new podcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askari. In this series of podcasts, which we will do every week in this year, 2021, to explore almost every aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road, from different perspectives, both from geographical perspective, but also from thematic perspective.
Yes.
And bring you objective and factual information from some of the best experts in the world on these different themes. Today, we're gonna take you to outer space. We have the idea of the Space Silk Road. And to do that, we have with us one of the best authors on space matters from a global perspective, Mr. Brian Harvey from Dublin, Ireland. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you too for taking the time of being with us on this Belt and Road Institute in Sweden podcast series. We really appreciate you taking the time. Now, as I understand, people look you up, you have authored almost 14 books, I guess. The latest one in 2019 called China in Space, The Great Leap Forward. But you have also covered the space programs of the United States, India, Japan, and recently China. But please let us know a little bit about you and your background and what kind of work you have been doing.
Okay, certainly. First of all, I'm not a scientist. I'm a historian. My university degree is in history, which I got in Trinity College, Dublin, with a master's in economic and social history from University College Dublin. So I'm interested in the history of things. My first book on spaceflight was a history of what we now call the Soviet space program in 1986. And I followed that with books on other programs on space programs in other countries. My first book on the Chinese space program was in the late 1990s. The Chinese space program was not well known then, but there's been a lot of interest in it. So my publisher, which is Springer, has asked me to update the original book 4 times now, but that of itself tells a story of the very rapid pace of development of the Chinese space program. And I don't think any of us looking at the Chinese space program in the 1990s could have imagined that it would have advanced as far as it has since then.
Yes, thank you. Now, just before we go into the Chinese space program and the Space Silk Road, we would like to just know from you as a space historian that humans, we have a fascination with space. This goes back, it's almost part of our nature to explore the universe around us. But why do we need to learn about space? What is so interesting about space exploration? And many people say, well, we have many problems on Earth. We have poverty, we have hunger. Why should we invest so much in space exploration? What does it help humanity here on Earth?
I think if we suddenly, for the sake of an argument, cut spaceflight out of our lives this morning, by lunchtime, planes could not fly because they rely on navigation satellites. We would no longer get television from satellites, so we would have to talk to ourselves in the evening and not watch television anymore. We would lose international communications. We receive live television from all over the world now. I can remember when I was very young, if something happened in Africa or the United States, you had to wait until an airplane brought the film cassette back to you, and then you watched it in a cinema on a newsreel program. We would be back to that again, I would imagine. Long distance phone calls, forget about them. Weather forecasting, forget about your weather maps, and so on and so forth. And one can also think of the many appliances in the home. For example, we forget that the high pressure pumps in dishwashers were based on, in part, the engine on the lunar module that traveled to the moon in the 1960s. And the everything from that to the non-stick frying pan is often quoted as an example. But we have learned so many things and applied so many things into our economies from spaceflight development that were completely unanticipated at the time. When the first Sputnik was launched in 1957, they did not have in mind, how can we turn this into a non-stick frying pan application? The point is, until you do what might be called the pure science first, you're not going to know the benefits until later. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is a very good point you've made about the issue of poverty and hunger, deprivation, and so on Earth. And you were absolutely right about that. I think there is a very good case that we need to do both. You see this most visibly, I think, if I may go to another country briefly, in India, where the Indian space program was from the very first geared around poverty, illiteracy, and education. When the first Indian communication satellites were put up, they beamed their signal not to rich people in cities, but to poor people in the countryside. And they carried programs about how do you rear chickens? How do you run literacy programs? Family planning from orbit. And then they developed Earth applications to improve the farming for the poorest communities, and so on and so forth. So you can orientate your space program around those who need it most. And I think one could make the case that one should orientate the program around those who need it most. So, and certainly in India in particular, but which is the sharpest example, the Indians do not see investment in space and investment in dealing with poverty, hunger, illiteracy, and so on as contradictory. They say them as two parts of the same thing. And in fairness, most space programs all over the world can be applied to everyone, and they should be.
Yes, thank you. That's a great explanation. Now we go to the China space program per se. I'm still waiting for your book. I ordered it, China in Space, The Great Leap Forward. Now, what is the Chinese space program? What is its origins? And what are the goals of the Chinese space program?
The Chinese space program goes back further, arguably, than almost any other country. Excuse me. We need to remember that China was a great astronomical civilization 2,000 years before Christ. It followed in the steps of the great astronomical civilization of the Nile, of Baghdad, of the other great astronomical centers. And there are Chinese astronomical records that go back 4,000 years at this stage. And in the past 2 millennia, China led the world in making star maps, in its theoretical models of the universe, and so on. The rocket was actually invented in China in 1274. The rocket being defined as a self-propelled vehicle with some kind of fuel on it, with some kind of steering. They were used as weapons of war, it has to be said. But these were not just little fireworks. They were a lot more sophisticated than that. Those rockets then went to India. The Indians used them to defend themselves against the East India Company in the 1790s. But were not successful, but that was probably not the fault of the rockets. And from India, the rockets found their way to Britain, and there was actually a group of rocket troops in the British Army that fought against Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. So the rocket came to Europe then in the very early 19th century. China, I think, resumed rocket development not until 1956. 1956 is the big landmark because on the 8th of October 1956, Zhou Enlai announced the start of the Chinese space program, and the person he got to do it was Qian Shushen, who was a very famous Chinese rocket engine and rocket designer who was from China. He had gone to the United States to study. He was the founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California.
A Chinese scientist.
Yes, which in effect began the conquest of the solar system, in which the Americans so excel to the present day. He was entrusted by Zhou Enlai, the foreign minister, prime minister, to build the Chinese space program in 1956, but from almost nothing. The most advanced mechanical things in China at the time were the bicycle and the diesel engine. So it was starting from a very low base. However, China still managed, despite difficulties, despite the Cultural Revolution, which was a very big problem if you were interested in space research, to put the first Chinese satellite into orbit in 1970, which came after Russia, the United States, France, and Japan. And from there, the Chinese built up their program very slowly, it has to be said. The number of launchings in the 1970s and 80s were only 1 or 2 a year, and there were some years when they had no launchings. But they did progress, the Chinese progressed by what I would call a big leap approach. First you do a satellite, 5 years later you do a recoverable spacecraft that you bring back, and that was technically very challenging. Then 6 years later, you develop a hydrogen-powered, very powerful rocket to put a communication satellite over the equator. That again was very, very difficult, but they were successful on that. And you then had the beginnings of quite a big expansion of the Chinese space program in 1992, with the commitment to piloted manned flight, which came true in 2003 when Yang Liwei made the first human space flight for China. And from that point on, China's space program has expanded very rapidly, particularly in the past 5 years, because a new launch site was built in Wenchang on the island of Hainan at the very southern end of China. And China also began the process of replacing all its old rockets, which go back to the 1970s, the Long March 2, 3, and 4, with a large number of new and much more powerful rockets, the Long March 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 11. Some of those have not yet been completed, but if you look at the actual facilities for space construction and development, those in China are probably the most modern in the world. If you go to their buildings, they're full of gleaming steel and glass. They're very modern. They look like they were built just yesterday. They probably were. And I think other countries are probably quite envious as to the modernity of the facilities which China has to hand at the moment.
If I may interrupt you, is this a completely indigenous Chinese? I mean, the technology, the engineering, the materials, or were there any cooperation with other nations for technology transfer? Or
there are two answers to that question. One is yes, it is largely indigenous, partly because, and here we do get into the politics, which is that China has been under restrictions, sanctions, mainly from the United States from 1949. There was a brief period, 1989 to 1999, when these were lightened or lifted. So China has had to develop an indigenous space program by itself. But there are many ways in which that is actually China's preference. And when China's first satellite was launched, Zhou Enlai insisted that the following words be added to the communique. And these words were, "We did this through our own unaided efforts." And he was very proud of that. And he persuaded some scientists to come back from abroad to help and stay with him in this very big national undertaking. However, having said that, I mean, China has engaged in cooperation from the beginning, cooperation with Europe, for example, with the Tansei solar satellites at the end of the last century. China has tried to open ways to many other countries for cooperation. Those have been most successful with the European Space Agency countries. There was some contact initially between China and the old Soviet Union. And there was a treaty between the two from 1956 to 60, but that ended with what was called the Great Split, which was a political question in 1960. But China returned to Russia when Russia became Russia after the Soviet period in 1992. And China sent two prospective astronauts for training to Startown. and also asked the Russians for and paid for commercially a docking system, life support systems, and space suits, because those were areas in which China felt it was particularly weak and where it felt it was best to borrow from the experts, so it did so. It has often been said that China has, quote, copied other people's technology, but at the end of the day, I don't think that really stands up, because at the end of the day, you have to build your own spacecraft yourself with your own hardware, software, everything else. And there's no substitute but for doing these things yourselves. So it is very, very largely an indigenous program. If all, for the sake of argument, if all foreign connections were cut in the morning, the Chinese space program would be able to continue with very, very little interruption.
That's fascinating, because I mean, if we look at the goals of the Chinese space program, I mean, China has also is developing alternative, as you say. If they are cut from the international communication system, they would have to need their own independent system, like, you know, their Baidu, the global positioning system, and so on and so forth. Because unfortunately, as you said, we have tension, geopolitical tension in the world, which sees China's rise and economic and scientific development as a threat. And that becomes counterproductive, because both everyone can learn something from the others. And that's where, you know, we get interruption in the communication between scientists. And many, now, even in the United States, there's some sort of a witch hunt against Chinese scientists in different fields. So I think this is counterproductive for science in general, for space exploration in general. But that brings us to the prospects of international cooperation and what we call, or can be called, the Space Silk Road. But yes, does the Space Silk Road exist, or is it just an idea or a notion?
Oh, I think it's more than an idea and a notion. The Silk Road, as you know, comprises many, many different elements and works with many different countries, and is a way in which China is trying to find methods of opening up commercial and other trading opportunities with countries in the Arab region, North Africa, Europe, Russia, and so on. And space has been part of that. Although China has been excluded from significant parts of the world launcher market by the United States, China has nevertheless managed to do business with quite a number of other countries in Africa, in Asia, and in South America, in launching, in fact, in building their communication satellites, in launching them, but also in training those countries themselves in how to use them. The Silk Road, however, does not extend to all those countries. And here it is most evident in the countries across what are generally called the Middle East, North Africa, and into Europe. And here China has developed quite a number of contacts in the space business, for example, launching an Ethiopian satellite last year, for example, in building ground terminals in Tunisia, in assisting in the Egyptian space industry, in launching 2 satellites at this stage for Nigeria. And the sanctions regime imposed by the Americans has not affected those, and one could make an economic argument that these are not economically dominant countries, so therefore that is affordable to the United States in some kind of economic way. However, the main connection in space has been through the Baidu satellite navigation system. And this is interesting from a number of points of view. First of all, China did attempt to do this in cooperation with Europe, and made a number of overtures to the European Space Agency for a joint approach to a Chinese-European satellite navigation system, because up to that point, there were only 2 satellite navigation systems in the world: the American one, GPS, which is very well known, the Russian system, GLONASS, not quite so well known, but in fact, a lot of people use it, although they may not realize it. And then Europe was hoping to develop its own one called Galileo. China approached Europe, but again, the Americans said no, and in effect vetoed that development. So China went ahead anyway and built the Baidu system, which is an extensive system of 30 to 36 satellites in 3 different types of orbit around the Earth. Now you might say, well, what has navigation satellites got to do with economic development? Well, actually, a lot more than you might think. Airplanes depend on satellite navigation. Ships depend on satellite navigation, and they're very good for planes and ships because they tell you where you are within 10 meters or so, so they're very accurate. But this is going to be so much more important for the forthcoming technologies. When, for example, driverless cars come in, who is going to navigate them? Well, the answer is satellites are going to help a lot in that. How do you steer a drone through the sky? Well, again, satellite navigation is going to be critical there. And that's why the Baidu satellite navigation system, which was completed in its present form last year with the final launch of the idea is 30 satellites operational at any one time with on-orbit spares available should one break down. So navigation satellites are things we use a lot more than we imagine. They are not directly charged to customers in the sense that you or I could go out with a telephone and call up a satellite navigation to say, well, where am I if you're going on a cross-country walk? And it will tell you very precisely. But in fact, the way in which those services are charged for is through the microchip that is put into your phone, the microchip that goes into the computer you're probably looking at the moment, and which follows you around normally for the benefit of commercial companies to make offers to you, but they pay for that, okay? So it's the chips that go into the mobile phone, the new driverless cars, the airplanes, the ships and so on. That's why navigation satellite systems are expensive, but it's also why they do make money for their makers. And the Baidu system has been very much at the forefront of the Silk Road and the way in which that has driven into the Middle Eastern countries and into North Africa. And it's no accident that the most recent World Conference on the Baidu system was held in Tunis, in North Africa, because of China's desire to involve the Arab countries in particular in it. Because if you look at it, the Arab countries many of them are quite large. They have big distances. Look at neighboring Algeria, one of the largest countries in North Africa. Places like that really do need good, accurate, modern navigation systems. They may also, back to the politics for a moment, be countries that the United States may not be so interested in because economically they may not be so valuable to them. So China, in effect, is looking at economic opportunities to work with countries that are not as well technically developed, but at the same time, I don't think one should consider these countries as technically backward. That may be a Western preconception. So you may find quite a good marriage between the state of technological development in these countries and China's ability to offer something which these countries don't have, satellite navigation systems of this kind. So I think that is part of the reasons of this concurrence of China, the Belt Road, and these countries that are seeking to develop what will be really important in the future, which is the satellite navigation base for economic and particularly transport and computer-based development.
Right. Yeah, this is, I mean, the connection between the physical realities of the Belt and Road Initiative, like transport and all these other aspects, and the space technology that exists, which is it's a quite fascinating and little known. You know, we think that these satellite and everything, it has all to do with the internet and entertainment and Facebook and all these kinds of things, but there are real life issues. Including in agriculture, I saw a program where even farm machinery can be run with the help of, these global navigation systems.
Yes.
So these are very crucial for, the real productive processes that go on Earth. But now this can bring us also to the fact that there are things we can do in space. Whether on the moon or on Mars, we have this fascinating traffic jam in late February, March around Mars, where you had the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and China, all three of them sending these probes to Mars. For China, I think it's the first time. But the fascinating thing is that the head of NASA, Brian at the time, he sent a message of congratulations to the Chinese, saying that we welcome here, we welcome this move. And that's where we get into this incredible dichotomy between the scientists, the objectives of humanity, but then we have the politicians and geopolitical problems, which now is weaponizing space. Rather than working together to develop the science and the potential for all humanity, we have this so-called competition, which becomes a zero-sum game, as if space is too limited for everyone to be there. It's like too small. And the United States just launched in the previous administration the so-called the Space Force. It's like a combat system against allegedly Russia and China, who are trying to use their space programs to undermine the United States, to control space, to harm the United States and Europe and so on. We had also, unfortunately, here in Sweden, the Swedish Space Corporation, they decided to stop the cooperation with the Chinese Space Agency here in northern Sweden, where there was scientific cooperation, obviously under pressure from military circles here, who said that the Chinese would potentially be using this kind of communication to spy and to harm Swedish and Western interests. Now, how true is it that this is a potential, and why this could be counterproductive?
Yes, I would imagine so. I mean, I've been to and hope to go to again to international scientific conferences, and there is never any problem between the scientists of all the different sides. They get on very well together and respect one another's work and activities and research very well. So the difficulties are not at that level, but as you say, there are very real political problems on our planet, and a lot of the United States-China rivalry or standoff or antagonism that is there at the moment in some ways reminds me of what happened in the 1960s when there was the great race to the moon between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that was a very clear struggle to reach a very particular objective. And I think it was very much felt that whoever gets there first will be seen to be world leader, however you wish to define that, and so on. And I think some of that framework is being applied nowadays, I think wrongly, because I think if we come back to the Chinese space program, it is often seen to be a challenge or indeed a threat to the United States. China essentially has developed its space program with reference to itself in the first case. And I mean, I think that my reference points for this are the Chinese government's own white papers, in which it says, this is why we do space. It comes back to answering your basic question at the beginning of this. Why are we doing this? And the government says it's for our economic benefit, it's for our social benefit, it's to develop these new technologies that can be applied on Earth. And granted that China does see itself as an ancient astronomical and now spacefaring civilization, its approach is very much to do things in its own time and its own way. And this idea that it is involved in some kind of race is a construct that is often applied to it, which may not necessarily be the case at all. And I think we are tending to look at what is happening now in the decade of the 2020s through the lens of the 1960s, which is not necessarily appropriate. It is certainly true that China would like to send people to the moon at the end of this decade or early next, and to Mars from the 2040s onward, and has said so, excuse me, and has said so many years ago. But that does not necessarily mean that it is absolutely desperate and all out to get there first, because I don't think that is the case at all. I think China wants to do it in its own times, and I think we do have to, and I would stress this, analyze the Chinese space program through the lens and ideas and concepts of the people who run that program, who devise it. In other words, Chinese people themselves, rather than through the lens of Western opinion and so on, because that can give us a somewhat disjointed and skewed idea of what is really happening. And although China has done things after other countries, I mean, almost everything it has done has been after other countries. The first satellite, the first communication satellite, the first man in space, its first woman in space, the space station. These all come after other countries have done them. But does that bother China particularly? No, it doesn't. Are Chinese people any the less proud of their achievements in spaceflight? I don't think so. So this is a country doing its own thing in its own time with reference to itself, obviously with an outlook on the rest of the world, as Baidu shows, as all the other things shows. But I think we really have to look at the Chinese space program through Chinese eyes more than through Western eyes, if we are really to understand it.
Right. Yeah, I think the idea that the space exploration and space missions are always a source of national pride,
yes,
that's not really bad. But what is more important is that the space exploration, what it has done to psychology of people on Earth is that, it creates a certain positive sense of optimism that we humans can solve problems, we can come to the moon, we can go to Mars, we can discover new things. I mean, that we are not really limited to this small, fragile planet, that there's a whole universe to explore, but not as Americans or Chinese, but as human beings. And I think this is what is fascinating when we listen to astronauts in the International Space Station, or scientists when they meet in conferences. They see only one humanity from space.
Yes, that's true.
And that's their concern. And as you say, the Chinese are not, of course, they will have to have Chinese flags all over the place. And that's not a bad thing, but they are not doing the space program and investing so heavily in it just to have a short film clip of national pride. There are other priorities. I mean, and every nation should have that kind of ambition. It's useful and helpful for humanity. I mean, we need to go out into space. We need to have a colony on Mars, on the moon. I mean, what the Chinese did by sending this incredible U-2 to the far side of the moon can open a new window to the universe, like the Hubble telescope did. And I think it's NASA got an exemption from the sanctions against China to help the Chinese with some sort of relay to help the Chinese probe in that mission. They got a certain exemption from the sanctions from Congress that they wanted to work with the Chinese on that specific mission.
Yes.
So, that it's really tragic that we have a world where we have political games that are becoming an obstacle to the progress of humanity in the long run. But now I wrote an article last year about the space program, although I'm not an expert, but I was looking at, because of the 50th year anniversary of the landing on the moon, the Apollo 11,
yes.
And one fascinating thing is that Neil Armstrong, when he lands, he said, "This is the one small step for man, but a giant leap for humanity or humankind." He didn't say it's a giant leap for the United States. And I think,
yes, I know. And in fact, there was a very nice comment made by the astronaut on Apollo 11, Michael Collins, who he didn't land on the moon, as you know. He orbited up above while his colleagues landed, and they went on a world tour afterwards. And he said the one thing that struck him most about people's comments when he met them all over the world was people used the phrase, "we landed on the moon." They didn't use the phrase, "the United States landed on the moon." They said, "we as Earth people landed on the moon." And he said he was very taken aback by that. He hadn't expected that. He liked it, but he hadn't expected it. Coming back to U2 and its exploration of the far side of the moon, That is one area that China struck out on, as it were, and went to do something that nobody else had ever done before. Um, and I know there's been a lot of admiration of that feat through the scientific community. And it's worth saying that the scientific return from U-2 has been very substantial. We have now thousands of photographs of Von Karman crater on the far side of the moon, which of course we can't see from Earth. The only people who have ever seen Von Karman crater, or of any of them, have been the Apollo astronauts who circled around the back of the moon as well as the front of the moon in 1969 to 72. U-2, for example, has a penetrating radar that looks about 10 meters below the surface. So we now are beginning to get maps of what kind of rocks do we have underneath the surface. Are they gravel? Are they small rocks, pebbles, big rocks? What does that tell us about the origin of the moon? And certainly I think science is an important driver of at least that part of the Chinese space program. And if you read, for example, the China Journal of Space Science or whatever, there are loads of reports now of the findings of U-2, its predecessor, the first U-2, the other scientific probes. And I think when hopefully Tianwen manages to soft land on Mars in June, they will be able to get some really interesting novel results back from that will complement the findings of the European, Russian, American, and other scientists that we know about that. But certainly China's contribution to space science has been growing all the time. Space science was not a well-developed part of the Chinese space program until the past 5 to 10 years, when a man called Wu Jie, who is the chief scientist there, took it in hand, reorganized it, set up a much better organizational system of pre-projects, project design, project approvals, all on a cyclical pipeline pattern and so on. So the Chinese space science program is now well organized and is producing a lot of returns. Could I give you just one practical example of that, which is China, in cooperation with Italy, launched an earthquake satellite 2 years ago called the Shanghai. And this satellite works on the principle that, and this was first tested by Soviet scientists, particularly a person called Sergei Pulinets, who figured out that an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours before an earthquake, we get precursor signs in the form of electromagnetic waves coming out of the Earth. And if we can pick up those waves, those electric waves, an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours before an earthquake or tsunami at sea, we can give people good warning and they can get to shelter or get inland or whatever they have to do. And in fact, we do know that in the case of the Soviet Mir space station, that was used to warn people of an earthquake in Japan before it happened. So that this is a very practical example of how spaceflight can save lives.
Right.
And this is just one example from the Chinese space program at present.
Right, interesting. Yeah, it's fascinating story. I mean, birds and other kind of creatures, they can get also early warning before an earthquake. So there are things you can detect ahead of an earthquake. But this also brings us to this humanity on planet Earth. We are not really in a friendly environment in the solar system and in the galaxy, because we have events before that. We have large asteroids, for example, hitting Earth, wiping out most of life, a form of life on Earth, and so on. That we actually, there are thousands and thousands of asteroids flying by Earth. Sometimes, like as happened in Chelyabinsk in Russia in 2014 or 13, it was like, it was reported that it was as powerful as 20 atomic bombs, but it exploded in space. Now, the Russians have actually proposed as a strategic defense of Earth, that the different space agency of the world, they should put together their efforts, their scientific and technological capabilities to detect and probably in the future detract this kind of threat from asteroids and other. So there are more things that space can help us here on Earth, but it needs the joint effort of, you know, almost every scientist on this planet. So I think there are things that we can work together. One of the things that you mentioned, U2, one of the instruments on U2 and the far side of the moon is a Swedish instrument developed by the Swedish Space Agency. It's some sort of a metal detector. It can figure out the types of metals on the surface, on the soil. And one of the things that I have read about, there are at least 2 or 3 statements. I don't know if it's officially in the Chinese space program, but one of the things they are looking for on the surface of moon, which doesn't exist on Earth, is if there's abundance of the element helium-3, which would be perfect for fusion power production on Earth, which helium-3 is a result of solar radiation hitting the surface of the moon. That's why we don't have it on Earth in such a way. So there are things that can happen in space that will be enormously beneficial for us on Earth. So we end our podcast on a positive note, rather than discussing all the terrible things that can happen. But where do you see the future of space exploration, the possibility of the West and East, China, the United States, Europe, working together in space for the betterment of life on Earth for humanity?
I think they can. I think to answer your question in 2 ways. First of all, back to the asteroid threat to Earth. The question is sometimes asked, what is the difference between us and the dinosaurs? And the answer is the dinosaurs didn't have a space program. So that I would imagine that technology now probably does exist to be able to deflect an asteroid or push it off course very slightly. And a lot of experiments are actually being planned on that at the moment. I imagine some of the world's biggest space programs could do it on their own, but it's always better if you do things together. Scientists have certainly discussed, and I've been at these discussions, where they've looked on a completely international basis of how to develop an international framework to spot asteroids. And the Chelyabinsk meteor, you're quite right, it got through. We didn't see it until it happened. So we need good detection systems, and then we need good and agreed means whereby they can be pushed away from Earth so they don't do any harm. And I think that will happen. I'd be reasonably confident that if we were threatened by an asteroid of any size, we would find a way to do it. But doing it internationally is a lot more efficient and economically than doing it any other way. Now, back to the moon. The Chang'e 8 mission, which is scheduled for later in this decade, will do what is called, in a rather ugly phrase, in situ resource utilization. In other words, it will look at the rocks and see the rocks on the moon, the soil on the moon, and see, can you turn them into water, for example? What are those different elements? Can you extract, as you mentioned there, helium-3 from them? So that's the beginning of that process. The idea of extracting helium-3 from the moon is not new. It goes back to the 1950s, I think, probably to the writings of Arthur C. Clarke. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. This is a long-term industrial project, I suspect, for our children or grandchildren. Nevertheless, the basic science around that can be and should be arguably looked at first now. And again, internationally is probably the best way to do that. So, I mean, I think to be positive, we do need to know that the international fora for space cooperation are there. They're very robust. They've been there since the 1950s. I think of COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research, which is where the world's space scientists meet every 2 years. I think of the International Astronautical Federation, which started in the early 1950s with, I think, 7 countries, mainly in Europe, but now embraces most countries around the world. And they are places where these issues are thrashed out and developed. So I think once we can develop the international frameworks much better, I recently completed a book on European-Russian cooperation in space. And one of the questions you ask yourself continuously throughout all of this, what are the benefits of cooperation? And there are a lot of benefits in the form of some countries are really good at some things and not so good at other things. Russia can be good at rocket engines, Europe can be good at some sides of space science and so on. You could apply the same approach to China, of course, as well. But one of the things that began to strike me towards the end of research is that the costs of non-cooperation are actually a lot higher. Cooperation costs money. You have to invest in getting to know people, talking to them, traveling to them, planning missions together, which is a lot slower than doing it on your own, setting down international frameworks, legal agreements, cooperation fora. That's time consuming. Getting the sides together, putting the support mechanisms in place, that costs money. However, the costs of not doing things together are generally a lot higher. You achieve a lot of, and this sounds rather bland and ordinary, you achieve a lot of efficiencies by doing things together, in sharing and pooling your efforts, whether that's in space science or applications or manned space flight or whatever else it is. So I think that's one of the practical messages I would give to you if you want to look at the more optimistic and better and politically more cooperative world, is to realize that the cost of doing things separately is actually a lot more than doing things together.
Well, that's really fascinating, and I'm really happy to have had this discussion with you, because I mean, the world from the viewpoint of scientists and historians looks much different than the world we see in the news programs every day.
Yes, it is, yeah.
And I think there is a reality. This is not a fantasy, it's a reality. It's a very concrete thing. The space cooperation, space exploration, these are very real and tangible things, but also they have a cultural impact. As you said, you know, there are things that our children and grandchildren do, which means we will not be alive to see them, but we have to set the stage for that to happen. I think the Chinese have this very long-term view of things, which we are losing a little bit here in the West, because our culture is focused on today and what I get today, rather than looking more long-term. And I think this is something we can learn from other cultures, is to think in terms of generations. And I think space gives us that window to look at history over very, very long arcs of time, and forget about our egoistic, you know, immediate needs and interest for today. Brian, I'm really looking forward to getting your book in the mail.
Okay, good.
Which I have ordered. China in Space, The Great Leap Forward. I really enjoyed talking to you today. We have learned a lot from your knowledge and your research. I will have the connection to Brian's, where to find Brian on the internet. And I would like to thank you once again for being with us today.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of this very interesting and fascinating podcast. We welcome you to visit our YouTube channel and our website. You'll find the description below the video. And we, as we promised you, will have every week a special podcast on a special or different part of this Belt and Road Initiative and what it means for us humans all over the world. So thank you for joining us today, and I thank Brian again, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Okay, you're very welcome. Thank you. Okay.